Chapter 2 is an overview of the nonprofit sector, and I would encourage you to spend ample time reading and reviewing and studying the information that is included in these early chapters to give you the best foundation to understanding nonprofit organizations and the entire nonprofit sector. This text contains some of the historical highlights in the evolution of nonprofit organizations in the United States. Nonprofit organizations have deep roots in American history and culture. The Greco-Roman culture emphasized community, citizenry, social responsibility. The Judeo-Christian culture emphasized helping others. In the modern nonprofit sector, the evolution of nonprofits through the wealth of the Industrial Revolution, with key people being Andrew Carnegie and his book, The Gospel of Wealth, and then also John D. Rockefeller. It's key to understand how those two individuals influenced the rise of nonprofit organizations in the United States, as well as the wealth that resulted from the Industrial Revolution fueling that change in the makeup of nonprofit organizations in the United States. And then in the 1960s and early 70s, there was an expansion in federal spending for social programs by President Lyndon Johnson. So that money fueled the support of nonprofit organizations in the early 60s and 70s. And then the Flower Commission in 1975 defined the actual nonprofit sector. So those are also key events to remember: the Flower Commission in 1975, as well as the expansion in federal spending in the 60s and 70s. Then in the 1980s, as I had mentioned in the previous podcast, the federal spending was reduced for social programs in the 80s, and that was a turning point for nonprofit organizations because of the lack of or the reduction in federal spending. And then in the 1990s, there was a booming economy in the United States, and there was an 81% increase in wealthy individuals creating foundations. And this expanded the funds available to nonprofit programs. So these are the highlights, but do read over the history and the evolution of nonprofit organizations in the United States. Now that we've discussed some of the highlights in the history, let's talk about the difference between charity and philanthropy. These terms are often used interchangeably, but there are two different types of giving. Charity is giving intended to meet the current individual human needs or to alleviate human suffering, whereas philanthropy is voluntary action for the public good, supporting long-term investment in the infrastructure of society. So philanthropy would be more Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, giving their money voluntarily for the public good, and that's a long-term investment in the infrastructure of society, whereas charity is giving intended to meet an individual situation or to alleviate human suffering. So know the difference between those two terms. This slide talks about other terms. Nonprofit terminology does not fully capture the purpose or diversity of organizations in the sector, but that is the term that we use. It's a broad term that describes many different kinds of organizations. Other terms that may be used to describe the nonprofit sector, which you will run across not only in the text, but if you work in the sector, are terms such as not-for-profit, independent sector, third sector, charitable sector, voluntary sector, tax-exempt sector, civil society sector, social enterprise, and social sector. You'll hear a lot about social enterprise and social sector, especially when we get to the end of the textbook. But it's important for you to understand that the term nonprofit organization refers to many different kinds of organizations, and also the sector itself can be described in different ways. So now we need to talk about the difference between domestic and international nonprofit organizations. In the United States, domestically at home, we refer to them mainly as nonprofit or nonprofit organizations, and the other terms that I had mentioned earlier to describe the sector. But internationally, you'll hear the term often NGO, which is a non-governmental organization. Non-governmental organizations perform government-like functions in the countries that they serve. They're not government organizations, they are nonprofit organizations, but they oftentimes will fulfill that function. And most NGOs receive a substantial portion of their revenue from government sources. Nonprofits may earn profits. This is an important slide, an important concept for you to understand, that nonprofit organizations may earn a profit that's used to further programs rather than rich individuals. Some people may think that nonprofit organizations, the term means that the organization may not earn a profit, and that is not the case. Nonprofit organizations need to earn a profit most of the time to reinvest within their programs. Nonprofit organizations operate under a non-distribution constraint, and that's a term for you to know. Where the profits are not distributed, they are called retained earnings and are kept within the organization to further the programs and further the mission of the nonprofit organization. Whereas in a for-profit business, those earnings may be distributed to the stockholders. Hybrid organizations, there are an increasing number of organizations that are operating under both nonprofit and for-profit legal forms. So where there may be an organization that is basically a nonprofit that has a subsector or a section that operates under a different legal form and operates as a for-profit. But the important takeaway here is for you to understand that nonprofits may earn profits, and those are used to further their programs and further the mission, not to enrich individuals. The size of the sector in the United States might surprise you. This is data from the independent sector in 2005, which indicated 1.91 million nonprofit organizations existed in the United States, with 1.5 million being charitable nonprofits. We'll talk about charitable nonprofits more in the future. These are the 501c3s, which you hear about all the time. Those are the ones that you hear about most often, that particular legal form under the IRS subsection 501c3. There are 1.5 million charitable nonprofits, 140,000 social welfare or advocacy nonprofits. And we'll talk about those also. That's a different part of the 501 IRS a tax category, but this is the 501c4, which is the social welfare or advocacy nonprofits. There's 140,000 of those. So by far the majority are charitable nonprofits. 12.9 million employees in 2005, which is 9.7% of the U.S. workforce. So almost 10% of the U.S. workforce were employed in nonprofit organizations found in this study. $1.1 trillion in spending, or 5% of the U.S. GDP. So that gives you an idea of the extensiveness of the nonprofit sector. So we're going to talk about the strategies for categorizing nonprofits and nonprofit organizations. And one of the categories is by purposes and activities. The National Taxonomy of Exempt Entities, NTEE, does this kind of classification, as well as the Internal Revenue Service for tax reasons. So based on the purpose and the activities, nonprofit organizations will be in different categories. And then also Solomon's anatomy, which we'll talk about in a minute, is by who benefits from the nonprofit organization. So that's another way to look at categorizing nonprofits. And then also to the degree to which nonprofits are commercialized or use business principles and methods. So that's a third way of looking at nonprofit organizations. How commercialized are they, and how many business principles and methods do they use? So I mentioned Solomon's anatomy, and this is discussed in your textbook, but this is a way of looking at nonprofits by classifying the nonprofit organizations by who receives the principal benefit of the organization's activities. So who is the benefactor of the nonprofit organization? Well, it can be member serving or it can be public serving. And in member serving, the organizations exist primarily to secure benefits for the people who belong to them or who support them. So that's, again, member serving. And then in public serving, these are the organizations that exist primarily to promote some aspect of social welfare. So that's another way of looking at nonprofit organizations, by who receive the principal benefit and if they are member serving or public serving. So this slide talks about the structure of the nonprofit sector. And again, it's another way of looking at and describing and explaining nonprofit organizations. So we talked in earlier slides about the difference between the nonprofit sector, the government sector, and the for-profit sector. This is a graphic depiction of that. So if we take a look at just the nonprofit sector, then we can divide the nonprofit organizations into three different boxes. And in box A, we have religious congregations. Now they're tax exempt under the 501c3, but they're not required to register with the IRS, although many of them do. And we take a look at box B, and we have tax exempt organizations which are registered under section 501. And that'll be further divided. But let's take another look at box C, which is the tax exempt organizations that are registered under IRC sections other than 501c. So there are tax exempt organizations that are in a different tax classification than the ones that we're going to be talking about most often in this particular class. So let's go back. We're in box B, tax exempt organizations registered under 501c. Then that is further divided into three boxes, which is box D, E, and F. So box D, this is the section that we had mentioned, social welfare organizations earlier, where there was 140,000 of those in 2005 in the United States. Well, that's 501c4, social welfare, which are advocacy organizations. We'll talk more about advocacy organizations, and you'll learn more about those as we go along. But the important distinction here is that those are different from box E, which is the 501c3 charitable nonprofits. Then those are further divided, but there's another box called other nonprofit organizations under section 501c. So let's go back to box E, where we are talking about charitable nonprofits. Those are divided into two boxes, box G and H, which are public charities and private foundations. So the important thing is we go back to the top. We're talking about nonprofits. We're talking about box B, the tax-exempt organizations, and then those are further divided down into social welfare, charitable nonprofits, and other types of nonprofits. And then the charitable nonprofits, which we're going to be talking most about in this course, are further divided into public charities and private foundations. So 501c3, and then public charities and private foundations. So understand how those are all fitting together in this depiction. Because it can be confusing, I've included another type of depiction of the differences between public charities, private foundations, and other exempt type of organizations. So it's not really clear on this slide, but you have this in the PDF that you can print out and take a look at. So it is clear to you about the overview of the categories. So here it's talking about nonprofit organizations include everything from neighborhood associations that meet a couple of times a year and have no assets to Harvard University and the Gates Foundation, each with billions in assets. They include soup kitchens and traditional charities that serve the poor, as well as local churches, the Chamber of Commerce, the Sierra Club, the United States Steelworkers Labor Union, and the Metropolitan Opera. So there's no one size that fits all, and this is a way to think about nonprofit organizations where they're divided into three major categories: the public charities, the private foundations, and then there are other types. So within those other types, it's like labor unions and business leagues and social and recreational clubs. But these are all IRS categories, which you'll hear about, and that's why I wanted to emphasize this, because you can see that in other exempt organizations, you'll have the 501c5, 6, and 7. We've talked about 501c4 being the advocacy organizations, and then 501c3 being broken down into both public charities and private foundations. So again, another way to look at this and another depiction for you to study. And if I haven't said enough already on the differences between the categories and the types of organizations that are determined by the IRS tax code, here's another one which I put together for you, which is it's helpful for me to think about nonprofit organizations in this way. So there are three primary sectors of society: the for-profit, government, and the nonprofit. So we're going to talk about the nonprofit, which is divided into three types of tax-exempt organizations. You have the religious congregations, those are the churches.